There is a courtroom in Berlin, 1921. A young man sits accused of murder. He openly admits he did it. He pulled the trigger in broad daylight in front of witnesses on a crowded street. The jury deliberates. Then they return a verdict that will quietly reshape the entire concept of international justice. Not guilty. The man who was shot, Talayat Pasha, was one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman Empire. The man who shot him had no political connections, no army behind him, no government protecting him. Just a pistol, a borrowed apartment, and a memory that would not let him rest. The question is not whether Soghomon Tehlirian was guilty. He was. He said so himself. The question, and this is the one that matters, is what happens when a civilization decides that some crimes are so vast, so monstrous, that ordinary justice has no language for them. That question did not exist before this moment. Tehlirian invented it, not intentionally. He was not a philosopher. He was not even particularly political. He was something simpler and more dangerous, a man who had seen everything taken from him and survived anyway and could not figure out what you were supposed to do with that. Let us go back. The Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century was a dying structure held together mostly by its own conviction that it wasn't dying. Empires in decline are among the most predictable creatures in history. They identify an internal enemy, they attribute their failures to that enemy, and then they do something that civilizations have been doing with remarkable consistency since before recorded history. If you are new to this channel, consider subscribing. History rewards patience, and so do we. The Armenians had lived in Anatolia for millennia. They were Christian in a majority Muslim empire. They were often educated, often merchants, often prosperous. Three qualities that are, historically speaking, an excellent way to make powerful people deeply uncomfortable. By the time the First World War began, the Committee of Union and Progress, known informally as the Young Turks, had a plan for what to do with that discomfort. They called it relocation. History would call it something else. Talayat Pasha was the architect. He was the interior minister of the Ottoman Empire, which is a title that sounds administrative until you understand that in 1915 the interior was on fire. He was by most accounts an intelligent man, organized, pragmatic. He believed, as many powerful men have believed before and since, that the survival of the state justified the removal of inconvenient populations. He signed the orders. He watched the machinery move. He did not, as far as we know, lose much sleep. Soghomon Tehlirian was 18 years old when the deportations began. He was from the town of Erzinga in eastern Anatolia. He had siblings, he had parents, he had a life that was ordinary in all the ways that matter, meaning that it was his and it was enough, and then it was gone. What happened to his family during the deportations in 1915 is not disputed. They were marched into the desert. Most of them died. Soghomon himself was beaten and left for dead. He survived by accident, which is sometimes how history chooses its instruments. He wandered. He made his way to Constantinople, then to Serbia, where he actually fought in the First World War on the Serbian front. There is a particular irony in a genocide survivor enlisting in someone else's war, as though having lost everything, he had also lost the instinct for self-preservation. Or perhaps he had simply recalibrated what surviving was worth. After the war, he ended up in Boston briefly, then Geneva, then Berlin. Berlin is where this becomes something else. By 1920, the men responsible for the Armenian massacres had been tried in absentia by Ottoman courts. This is the detail historians sometimes skip over, but it matters. Even the Ottoman government, after the war, had concluded that what happened was criminal. Talayat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Samal Pasha were sentenced to death in absentia, which is the legal system's elegant way of saying, we have reached a verdict and we intend to do absolutely nothing about it. Talayat Pasha was living comfortably in Berlin under a false name. Germany had been the Ottoman Empire's ally in the war. The German government knew who he was. They were not troubled by this. Powerful men who have committed large crimes have always understood that geography is among the most useful of legal defenses. Tehlirian knew where he was. He had joined loosely an operation called Nemesis, an Armenian Revolutionary Federation effort to locate and assassinate the architects of the genocide. The name was mythologically precise. Nemesis is the goddess of retribution, the force that corrects the imbalance when power goes too far without consequence. History's full of people who forgot about her. It never ends well. He watched Talat's apartment. He learned the man's routine. He rented a room across the street and waited. This is the part that documentary filmmakers love, and rightly so, because waiting is the most honest part of any decision. You can justify almost anything in the abstract. The act of waiting, choosing every single morning to continue, is where the decision actually lives. Every day that Tehlirian watched that building was a day he could have walked away. He did not walk away. There is something worth sitting with here. He was not by temperament a violent man. His neighbors in Berlin described him as quiet, polite. He had nightmares. He would say so openly at trial, with a directness that the court found difficult to categorize. He had seizures likely from the trauma of what he had witnessed. He was, in the clinical language we would use now, severely damaged. In the language of 1920, he was simply a young man who had lived through something that had no name yet. The word genocide did not exist. Raphael Lemkin would coin it in 1944, partly inspired by this very case. The concept that a government could be prosecuted for systematically destroying its own population, that did not exist in law. There was no mechanism. There was no tribunal. There was no process by which Talat Pasha would ever face any consequence at all from any court in any country, ever. Tehlirian understood this, not as a legal scholar, as a man who had watched every institution fail completely and was working with what remained. On the morning of March 15, 1921, Talat Pasha left his apartment in Charlottenburg and walked down Hardenbergstrasse. It was an ordinary Berlin morning. People were going about ordinary things. Tehlirian had been watching for his moment. He stepped behind him on the pavement. He shot him once in the back of the head. Talat Pasha fell. He was dead before anything else could happen. Then Tehlirian stood there. He did not run immediately. There are accounts that suggest he was dazed, that the act of doing the thing he had decided to do had not quite resolved into reality yet. Bystanders tackled him. The police came. He did not resist. He told them immediately what he had done and why. The trial was, by any rational legal standard, an open and shut case of first-degree murder. The prosecution presented this argument with confidence, which in retrospect seems optimistic. The defense did something unusual. They did not argue that he was innocent of the act. They argued that the jury needed to understand what the act was a response to. They turned the trial into a hearing on the Armenian genocide, bringing survivors' testimony, documentary evidence of the massacres before a German court in 1921, before anyone had agreed on what to call what happened, or whether the word crime could even be applied to a state's actions against its own people. The jury was out for about an hour. Not guilty. The crowd in the courtroom applauded. Tehlirian was released that same day. He would later marry, move to the United States, and live until 1960. He gave occasional interviews. He did not appear to regret what he had done. He also did not appear to glorify it. He spoke about it the way people speak about things they had no other word for. Here's the irony that history tends to gloss over. The acquittal of Soghomon Tehlirian was one of the most consequential legal moments of the 20th century, and almost no one knows his name. If you find this kind of overlooked history compelling, and clearly you do since you are still here, subscribing to the channel is a reasonable response to that impulse. The trial established, informally but powerfully, that crimes against an entire people constituted something different from ordinary criminal acts. That a state could be morally culpable in a way that demanded some form of response beyond a verdict issued to an empty room. Lemkin, who attended or followed the proceedings closely, would spend the next 2 decades trying to translate that moral intuition into actual law. The Genocide Convention of 1948 is his answer. The Nuremberg trials are in part downstream of this moment. One man, one pistol, one ordinary Berlin morning. And the entire legal architecture of international humanitarian law shifts slightly, like tectonic plates adjusting to new weight. Talat Pasha, for his part, has a statue in Turkey. He was repatriated with full honors in 1943. History's consistent, at least, in its capacity to honor the wrong people. Tehlirian has a memorial in a few Armenian communities. He has a film. He has this documentary script being written a century later by someone who thinks about power and consequence for a living and is still somehow surprised by how neatly it all rhymes. We tell ourselves that justice is a system, that it has procedures and precedents and mechanisms for addressing wrongs that exceed ordinary human scale. We build courts, we write conventions, we create institutions with long, serious names, and then something happens, something vast and organized and official, and we discover that the system has a quiet limitation. It was designed by the powerful for situations the powerful anticipated, and it has significant gaps around situations the powerful preferred not to anticipate. What do you do when the gap is 1.5 million people? Tehlirian did not have an answer to that question in any philosophical sense. He had a very practical response, which is a different thing entirely. He was not trying to create international law. He was not trying to change history. He was trying to find something that would let him live with himself in a world that had decided the people who murdered his family would face no consequence whatsoever. He found it. And then, because history has an ironic sense of composition, his very private, very specific response became the foundation stone of everything the world would later build to prevent the next catastrophe. It did not prevent the next catastrophe. We have had several since, but the architecture exists now, at least. The language exists. The legal category exists. We can now name what happened, prosecute it, record it, mourn it with specific terminology. Whether we stop it is apparently a separate question, one we continue to work on with great seriousness and limited results. The man who kills a people. History does not quite know where to put him. He does not fit the category of hero, which requires victory. He does not fit the category of villain, which requires a coherent system of justice to have failed. He exists in the space between, which is where most of the interesting moral questions live and where no one is particularly comfortable visiting. Perhaps the deepest thing Tehlirian's story tells us is not about violence or justice or even genocide. It is about the human compulsion to do something, anything, when institutions collapse, when power becomes impunity, when the gap between what is and what should be grows so wide that one person decides to step into it. We build systems so that individuals don't have to make those choices. When the systems fail, the individuals don't stop existing. They just start watching apartment windows, and the rest of us spend a century debating what to call what happens next.